a technical problem. What? Okay, whatever. All right, so page 99. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon, and already the sun had valley to go to climbing up the slopes of in the sun. But by the pool among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak glanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed that little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of the wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave, and the sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides, and the brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet. A row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. And as quickly as it had come, the wind died, the clearing was quiet. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly Lenny appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked it clear of the water, and flew off down the river. The little snake slid in among the reeds of the pool's side, and Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water, and when the little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up and strained toward the sound with eyes and ears until he saw the bird and then dropped his head and drank again. When he finished, he sat down on the bank in his side of the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed out of the valley as it went, and the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with an increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget you, Bet. Goddamn. Hid in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George gonna give me hell," he said. "George gonna wish he was not having me bothering him." He turned his head and looked into the bright mountain tops. "I can go right there off and find a cave," and he continued sadly, "never have no catch-up. But I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And then from out of Lenny's head there came a fat little old woman. Here starts the hallucination. He is going to hallucinate his Aunt Clara. No lie, having like a just ridiculous, she's going to yell at him in Lenny's mind, of course. And then from out of Lenny's head there came a fat little old woman. She wore thick bullseye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she starched clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And then she said in what was in Lenny's voice, "I told you and I told you," she said. "I told you mind George, because he's such a nice fellow and he's good to you, but you don't ever take no care. You do bad things." Clara, ma'am, I tried and I tried. I couldn't help it. "You never give any thought to George," she went on in Lenny's voice. "You've been doing nice things for you all the time. And when he got a piece of pie, he always gave you half, or more than half. If there's any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you." "I know," said Lenny miserably. "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and I tried." She interrupted him. "All the time. He could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in a whorehouse. And he could have sat in a pool room and played snooker. But he got to take care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. "I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right off the hills and find a cave, and I'll live there so it won't take no more trouble to George." "You just say that," she said sharply. "You always saying that. But you know, son of a bitch, and well, you ain't gonna ever do it. You'll just stick around and stew at the bejesus out of him. George all the time." Lenny said, "I might as well just go away, George. Ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now." And Clara was gone, and out from Lenny's head came a gigantic rabbit, and it sat on its haunches in front of him and waggled its ears and crinkled its nose, and then it spoke in Lenny's voice too. "Tend rabbits," it said scornfully. "You crazy bastard, you ain't even fit to lick the boots of no rabbits. You forgot to let him go, and you'd let him go hungry. That's what you'd do." "And then what's George going to think?" "I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't," said the rabbit. "You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George going to let you tend the rabbits, you even crazier than usual. He ain't. He's going to beat the hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's going to do." Now, we both know that's not true. Now, Lenny retorted belligerently. "He ain't neither. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I knew George since I forget when, and he ain't never raised his hand to me with no stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean." "Well, he's sick of you," said the rabbit. "He's gonna beat the hell out of you and go away and leave you. He won't, Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. But the rabbit repeated softly, over and over, he gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. And Lenny put his hands over his ears. He ain't, I tell you, he ain't. And he cried, oh, George, George. George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, what the hell you yelling about? Lenny got up on his knees. You ain't gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't. George came stiffly near him and sat down beside him. No. I knowed it, Lenny cried. You ain't the kind. George was silent. Lenny said, George? Yeah, I done another bad thing. It don't make no difference, George said, and he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges of the sun now, the shadow in the valley were blue and soft, and from the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another, and George turned his head and listened to the shouts, and Lenny said, George? Yeah? Ain't you gonna give me hell? Give you hell? Sure, like you done before. Like if I didn't have you, I'd just take my $50. Jesus Christ, Lenny, you can't remember nothing that happens, but you remember every word I say. Well, ain't you gonna say it? George shook himself. He said woodenly, if I was alone, I could live so easy. His voice was monotonous for emphasis. I could get a job and not have no mess. He stopped. Go on, Lenny, and at the end of the month come, and at the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to the cat house. He stopped again, and Lenny looked eagerly at him. Go on, George. Ain't you going to give me no more hell? No, said George. Well, I can go away, said Lenny. I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. And George shook himself again. No, he said. I want you to stay here with me. Lenny said craftily, tell me like you done before. Tell you what? About the other guys and about us. George said, guys like us got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it. They ever got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about them. But not us, Lenny cried happily. Tell about us now, George. And George was quiet for a moment. But not us, he said. Because I got you and I got you. And we got each other. That's what that gives a hoot in hell about us. And Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled, and the wind waves flowed up the green pool, and the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. George took off his hat, and he said shakily, take off your hat, Lenny. The air feels fine. Lenny removed his hat dutifully, and he laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was a bluer, and the evening came fast. And on the wind, the sound of the crashing in the brush came to them. And Lenny said, tell how it's going to be. George had been listening to the distant sounds, and for a moment he was businesslike. Look across the river, Lenny. I'll tell you what so you can almost see it. Lenny turned his head and looked across the pool at the darkening slopes of the Gabalons. We're going to get a little place, George began. He reached in his side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the gun lay on the ground behind Lenny's back, and he looked at the back of the place joined. The man's voice called from up the river, and another man answered. Go on, said Lenny. George raised his gun, and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. Go on, said Lenny. How's it going to be? We're going to get a little place. We'll have a cow, said George, and we'll have a pig and chickens, and down the flat we'll have a little piece of alfalfa. For the rabbits, Lenny shouted. For the rabbits, George repeated. And I get to tend the rabbits, and you get to tend the rabbits. Lenny giggled with happiness. And live off the fat of the land. Yes. Lenny turned his head. No, Lenny, look down and across the river like you can almost see the place. Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now. George turned back and looked toward them. Go on, George. When are we going to do it? We're going to do it soon. Me and you. You and me. Everybody going to be nice to you. There ain't going to be no more trouble. Nobody's going to hurt nobody nor steal from them. Lenny said, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, said George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't mad now. That's the thing I want you to know. The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, let's do it now. Let's get that place now. Sure, right now. We gotta. And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the back of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied, and he pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again, and Lenny jarred and then settled slowly forward in the sand, and then he lay without quivering. George shivered and looked at the gun and then threw it from him, back on the bank near the pile of old ashes. The brush seemed filled with cries and the sound of running feet, and Slim's voice shouted, George, where you at, George? And when George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away, the George The group burst into the clearing. Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying in the sand. God, and by God, he went over and looked at him and at Lenny and then came back at George. Right in the back of the head, he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close. Never you mind, said Slim. A guy got to sometimes. But Carlson was standing over George. How'd you do it? He asked. Well, I just done it, George said tiredly. Did he have my gun? Yeah, he had your gun. And you got it away from him, and then you took it and you killed him? Yeah, that's how. George was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. Come on, George. Me and you'll go get a drink. George let himself up to his feet. Yeah, a drink. And Slim said, You had it, George. I swear you had it. Come on with me. He led George to the entrance of the trail and up towards his highway, and Curly and Carlson looked after him, and Carlson said, Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys? We're done. I'll stop recording now.